Hi, thanks for watching. In earlier lessons, I've already done the same thing that I'm actually going to do in this lesson, compare features between Magento and Shopware. So this lesson is actually meant for you being a Magento developer and looking forward to have a peek into Shopware to see what it's all about. And in earlier lessons, I've already compared a couple of features like the database, commands, and a couple of other things. But in this lesson, I want to focus upon database repositories. I'm assuming that you're already familiar with repositories using them in Magento. So let's actually briefly go through them and through the usage of a repository before jumping into doing the same thing in Shopware. So in Magento, I'm just assuming that there's this swag example module. In Magento it's called a module, in Shopware it's called a plugin. The namespace could remain the same, and basically the fact that I'm using dependency injection to do something useful with a repository is even also going to be remaining the same. Now in Magento, the customer repository is used here in the first example, and let's actually head over to an example of loading a specific customer by its ID. Step one is to inject the customer repository interface into your constructor. Well, instantiating an interface into an object is impossible in PHP, so normally this would throw a specific PHP error. However, we're using dependency injection in Magento, and within Magento we're relying upon the DI container known as the object manager, and the object manager is then using a DI preference, a piece of XML, a rule, a statement, mapping this interface into an actual class. So the customer repository interface is mapped into a customer repository model class, and in the end that's being instantiated into an object called customer repository, injected into my own class, copied into a private variable, and then I can use that private variable as I see fit. So the customer repository has a method called getById, and I'm passing in a numeric ID, customer ID, and then out comes basically a customer entity, an instance of a customer interface, aka an instance of the customer model. So that's basically the procedure in Magento. Zero configuration. You simply just open up the PHP constructor in your own class, start injecting things into it, specifically the customer repository, and that's it. Now let's compare that with Shopware. Well, in Shopware we need a little bit more work. In Shopware we normally always need to begin with a service definition, normally written in XML and therefore ending up in a file called services.xml. And as soon as we open up a specific class and we want to add a dependency into it, we need to declare that dependency as an argument to that class. So the service ID is referring to the class that we've just created as part of the Magento module. Now we're going to use that same namespace in Shopware itself as well. Adding an argument to it of type is service, and that's going to lead into the actual dependency injection. However, I'm not injecting a class name. I'm actually referring to a specific string customer.repository. So under the hood, the service container of Shopware is kind of like doing the same thing as the object manager in Magento is doing. It's allowing for a mapping between A and B, between an interface and a class, but also between a string and the class name itself. In the end, because this is dependency injection with an actual service, and a type is service, means actually that there's going to be an object being inserted as a dependency. If it wouldn't be an object, if it would still be a string, you would get a fatal error that you're trying to inject the wrong thing. So in the end, the service container needs to take care of this translation between the string called customer.repository and an actual class instance. So when I was diving into Shopware, one of the first things I started to do was look for a class called customer repository. And unfortunately, such a class is not existing. That's one of the things that you need to know about working with repositories in Shopware. The whole logic of a repository is a little bit abstracted away. However, there is a customer entity, and that customer entity leads into a little bit of XML, but that's also leading into an entity class called customer entity actually, a customer entity definition class, and even a customer entity collection class. So 3 classes that make up a certain entity. But once that work has been done, then actually Shopware is just taking care of the rest. So the repository is actually the result of those 3 classes being constructed in the first place. That's a little bit of magic going on, but that's also leading into why we need that XML to begin with. So to allow for the magic to take place, we need to have an XML definition where we refer to customer.repository, while actually in the PHP class itself, we still need to refer to an object, but it's not the customer repository object, because there is no customer repository class, but we actually refer to the entity repository interface. An abstract interface to be used for any kind of entity, or more precisely, any type of entity repository. And if we inject this, and also if the name of this variable is customer repository, in the end, the Symfony DI container is going to automatically wire this argument to the argument that was defined in XML. And thanks to that process of wiring, this basically works. We're being injected with a class instance of entity repository, but that entity repository is pre-configured to behave as a front end towards the customer entity. So don't make the mistake of naming your object $entity repository, because that would be silly. You're not getting a generic entity repository, you're getting actually a customer repository, even though it looks a little bit strange. Well, enough being said about the DI container and about the dependency injection itself. The first step was a little bit of XML, and the second step is actually the DI, the constructor itself, to allow for that dependency injection to take place. As you can see already, it's a little bit more cumbersome. It's a little bit more work to get started with this than the one slide example of Magento. Now let's move to the final bit, because there's still a third slide as well. And that's basically related to the fact that the repository class, or the customer repository object, doesn't have a method like getById. And that's again related to another fact, which is that actually in the Shopware database, primary keys are not used to identify entities or any kind of entities or any kind of records in the database, but usually the primary key is replaced with a so-called UUID, a string composed of a 16-bit character range. And that string, the UUID, allows you to fetch a specific customer by its unique identifier. Well, theoretically, they could have built something like this and labeled it as a getById method anyway, but that's not the case. Within Shopware, what you need to do is you need to call upon the search method, pass in a certain first argument, the criteria, and if the criteria is not matching anything else but just an array, that is going to match with the primary key, or actually the UUID of the database table. So in effect, it's loading this UUID specifically in a specific context as well, which is returning a certain result, and that result might contain multiple search results. So even though UUIDs are supposed to be unique, the PHP code is suggesting that theoretically there's still the chance of getting multiple records back, and then we actually use this first method to return that first customer object. It's a lot of work to do something simple, and it almost makes me say that Shopware is more complex than Magento. Except for one little fact, which is as soon as you do one thing in Magento, it might make that first thing easy. But as soon as you want to do more with Magento, a lot of times actually Magento becomes more complex anyway. So we've seen now one little scenario of loading a specific entity by its unique identifier. And in that case, Magento was easier than Shopware. But let's actually take a look at another scenario of loading multiple entities. In Magento, that's boiling down to the usage of the getList method in the repository, which also requires another thing called the search criteria builder. So back to the original Magento example, I'm now expanding upon that same PHP constructor by now injecting, well, it's another example, no longer a customer repository, but I'm now injecting a product repository. And then on top of it, I'm also injecting this thing called the search criteria builder. Now, once that's being done, I can use those two dependencies within the rest of the code. And the whole goal is to call upon that method getList within the product repository. However, that getList method is actually expecting an argument of type search criteria, and I'm using the search criteria builder to build that search criteria. Actually, I can see a little line missing here. Just a second. So there we go again. Here's the fix. I'm calling upon the search criteria builder to add a specific filter, but then in the end, the search criteria builder is called upon with its create method. The create method is returning a search criteria object, and that's actually the argument to be passed on to the method getList. Now, it's almost not fitting on the slide, but after the getList is returning a response, you might say that you have your products, but you don't, because actually the end result or the return value of getList is a so-called search result. And then from that search result, I can get the items, a method called getItems, and that's actually the listing of all of the products. Now, the filter that we use here is now being constructed as with the keyword new filter. Well, some people say that the keyword new is forbidden in Magento code. Well, if you think that same way, then actually you need to build this filter also by injecting yourself with a filter factory. So that adds on top of the existing two dependencies a third dependency as well. But it's a little bit up to you whether you want to do that using a filter factory or by just calling upon new filter. The bottom line is basically that we've seen now this procedure searching for multiple products in this case requires also this thing called a search criteria builder. And automatically, once you dive into that matter of search criteria builders, the code becomes more complex. And that's what I wanted to point out, that maybe at the beginning it appeared as if Magento was easier than Shopware, but then with that statement you don't know Magento. And obviously once we get going with more other scenarios with Magento actually becomes a little bit more complex as well. And now compare this to the Shopware approach. So back to the Shopware approach, we're also going to try to do the same thing, matching multiple products or searching for the products in the database and matching for a specific keyword. The service definition that I'm showing right here is actually identical to the one that we've discussed earlier. We still have that same service. I'm injecting now a different repository, no longer the customer repository, but I'm injecting the product repository. And then actually the final bit is to, take a look again at how the code is being organized on the PHP side. So on the PHP side, I'm importing a couple of other dependencies, which we will see in a bit. But the PHP constructor is basically identical. I'm injecting myself with entity repository interface, which is leading into an object called product repository. And then together with the service definition in XML, the DI container is able to wire that all together. And actually wiring, more specifically also auto wiring, is one of the cooler features of the service container of Symfony. But the dependency injection bit is kind of like the same thing. Now moving on to the other part, which is basically how to get going with returning a listing of products and searching for that specific keyword. In this case, just a name equal to example. The code is actually identical as to the code before. I'm still calling upon that same method search. I'm still passing a first argument being a criteria object, but now the criteria object is no longer based upon an equals filter or simple array. I'm actually adding a more complex filter, the contains filter, which is boiling down to a select with a like where statement. So where name is like example, the context is still there, and then the end result is that I'm not calling upon the search results, its first method, but actually the get entities method. The return is actually an entity collection, but automatically when you put that collection to use, you will see that it basically behaves as an array, just like with the coding sample that we've seen with Magento. The bottom line is that actually this search bit that we do now for multiple products is not that much different from the search bit that we needed to do within the customer ID to fetch a specific customer by its UUID from the database. And that's maybe the main point that I want to make in this lesson. So maybe Shopware is at first more complex than Magento, and it requires definitely a little bit more work. But the bottom line is that you're trying to accomplish the same thing. It's still dependency injection. It's still certain configuration pointing into certain dependencies that you inject using your own PHP constructor. And then at first, Magento sounds more simple. But as soon as you get further into other scenarios, my personal belief is that actually the complexity within Shopware kind of like remains the same. And it's still flexible enough to accomplish the same scenarios that you want to build with Magento itself as well. However, with Magento, well, things are always bound to be a little bit more complex. That's a funny pun, but I still love Magento, but it shows basically that there's this different strategy of working with code. And definitely the method and mechanisms that Shopware provides are nice and cool and nice to look into. Well, that's it for this little lesson. Hopefully you've seen a little bit better how to work with repositories and how to inject them into your own Shopware code. Stay tuned for more because there's more comparisons between Magento and Shopware. And other than that, it's also proving that there's much more to tell about Shopware repositories in general. So there's also further videos coming up upon how to work with repositories in general, what else is possible within the Shopware codebase. So stay tuned for more, and I hope to see you in a bit.